Thank you very much, Past President Mark, President Joel, fellow Rotarians. Good morning. I
Yeah.
thank you all for taking the time off from what might be a lovely summer morning outdoors to spend a few minutes here on this topic. It's always a pleasure to join you at your meetings and even greater privilege to address you. I've been invited this morning, and the topic I wanted to talk about is the Guyana-Venezuela border dispute. It's a very sensitive subject. In fact, in Guyana, even calling it a dispute is fraught with its own political problems. At the present time, there is a case pending before the International Court of Justice. Those of you who keep up with international affairs might be aware of some amount of criticism that the International Court of Justice is facing. Criticism or praise, depending on how you perceive the issue, for their current investigations into the unfortunate events taking place in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. If we were to replace the ICJ, I rather suspect that we couldn't do much better than the present court that we have. It's impossible to do these things without criticism. That doesn't mean that the criticism is unwarranted. Who knows how we may perceive this issue in another 50 years from now. It's very difficult to form a fair perspective in the present moment with all the urgency of the activities taking place. In the case of Guyana, though, at least on our side, the court is a bit of a hero. Without the court, I'm not sure what we would do. You may recall there's a story told about the waning days of the Second World War when Prime Minister Churchill cautioned Joseph Stalin to take into account the views of the Pope. And to that, the Soviet leader responded, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? Unfortunately, even to the present time, international relations are determined by the size of your military and what you can do to defend the positions that you hold. Ghana finds itself in a very unfortunate situation where to our west, our neighbor Venezuela has a population of 30, 35 million and a standing army in the several hundred thousands. Ghana's population, domestic population, remains under 1 million people. I suspect you might be hard-pressed to find 100,000 able-bodied men between the age of 18 and 35. You might very well come close if you throw me in, but I think I've aged out of military service. Obviously, the budget, the equipment, the technology, there's no such thing as a Ghana-Venezuela war or skirmish that will take place. Every couple years, Venezuela will send a fighter jet across our airspace. They currently occupy an island in the river that separates us that belongs to Ghana. There really isn't much we can do. We believe that the government of Venezuela actively encourages criminal gangs that operate in the area that are pretty ruthless and terrorize mining and native Indian communities that live along the border. Our army does do a bit, but the area is, a lot of it is virgin jungle, rainforest. It's severely underpopulated, which may be a good or a bad thing, depending on how you see it. On the Venezuelan side, it's not much different, which might be a good thing. There aren't large populations or cities close to the border. The Venezuelan army has been building some roads and bridges. I understand that a couple of the bridges got washed away during bad weather. But the dispute goes back all the way to our joint colonial past, when the European powers occupied these lands. In Guyana's case, first the Dutch, briefly the French, very briefly the Spanish, and for about 200 years ago, the British finally took it in the early days of the 19th century. This, of course, ties into a lot of the wars between European powers. Guyana is really just a footnote in those activities. The British were pretty pissed after the American War of Independence, and they proceeded to go out of their way to ransack territories that belonged to rival European powers across the Caribbean, especially the Dutch. The Dutch had been helpful to the American colonies in their battle for independence, supplying general stuff, including munitions from a lot of small islands in the Caribbean. And so the British spent the next 30 years wreaking havoc by way of revenge. And the Dutch, of course, were not very powerful militarily. And in fact, the colony was occupied mainly by British planters who had settled here from Barbados about 50 years ago, who weren't very interested in fighting an English navy. So it was very easy for the British to take over. But the British were pretty efficient at the business of colonization. And one of the things they did, as far as this issue is concerned, is that they caused the boundaries to be demarcated by a German surveyor by the name of Robert Schomburg, which set out the line. I'm really not sure how Mr. Schomburg did it. I would love to understand his reasoning. I would love to have walked some of it with him. Not long, maybe a couple hours here or there, because I mean, what he would have covered to do his surveying would have been very difficult and hostile terrain. I mean, with all the modern amenities traveling around Guyana is still a very rugged experience, and doing it in 1840 without motor vehicles, satellite technology, and all the fancy things that we take for granted would have been interesting. But the line that was considered the line, apart from being done with unsophisticated technology, was really completely imaginary. There was really nothing there. There were spotted communities of Native Indians, quite arbitrary, but it was more or less settled. Venezuela by this time was an independent nation, and Venezuela had been complaining for a long time that the line of demarcation between its territory and the territory of the new British Guyana was not properly demarcated. Venezuela at the time was a close ally, very, very close ally of the United States. The United States by this time had all the various doctrines that you recall from your history classes about interference in its hemisphere, and took a keen interest in the matter, particularly from the Venezuela side. Venezuela was keen to retain an area of occupation in the Orinoco, which is an important river within its territory that is close to Ghana. And as it would play out, they were actually successful in getting most of what they wanted. In 1899, the United States effectively forced Great Britain to agree to arbitration with Venezuela. They set up a mixed commission. It was made up of 2 American jurists, 2 British jurists, and a Russian jurist. The Americans were considered the Venezuelan representatives on the panel. And they sat in Paris in 1899 for 55 days. They considered volumes and volumes and volumes of information. They settled an award, decided what would be Venezuela's territory, what would be Guyana's territory. And the award was considered final. In fact, Venezuela celebrated it. It was a great victory for them. And for 50 years, nothing more was heard on the matter because Venezuela was quite delighted. Great Britain really didn't care deeply. It was considered settled. They moved on. All the maps were drawn, no further quarrels. In 1949, a US lawyer by the name of Otto Schoenrich gave the Venezuelan government a memorandum that had been written by a man named Servo Mallet-Prevost, that was written by him in 1944, which he asked that only be published after his death. Mallet-Prevost surmised from the private behavior of judges that there was a political deal between the Russian and the British, and that the Russian chairman of the panel, Frederick Martins, had visited Britain with the British arbitrators during that summer of the arbitration, and had subsequently offered the American judges, who were Venezuela's representatives, a choice between accepting unanimously the lines ultimately drawn, or a 3-2 opinion that was more favorable to the British. Of course, this would be the Orinoco. The alternative would have followed the Schomburg line entirely, which Schomburg had done in 1840, and given the mouth of the Orinoco to the British, which Venezuela didn't want it. And Mallet-Prevost claimed that under pressure from the British and the Russian members of the panel, the Americans acceded and went along with Martins for depriving Venezuela of even more territory. Now, if you unpack this, there are 2 choices. I mean, I've never sat in a panel of judges, but I imagine that there's some horse trading that goes on about alternatives. Alternative A, which was rejected, and which would have been a 3-2 decision, would have given more of what is now Venezuelan's territory to British Guyana. Alternative B, which is what was selected, is the present boundary, which is more favorable to Venezuela than to British Guyana. Mallet-Prevost's memo that was published after his death has been used by Venezuela as the basis for agitation that the arbitration was flawed, and more than just flawed, it was fraudulent, dishonest, imperfect, and should be set aside. Now, as a general rule, arbitrations are intended to be final. You can't go back and complain. You certainly can't go back and rehash a quarrel 100 years later. But Venezuela was very interested in this in 1949. Their logic is not quite clear. The alternative would have been less favorable to them, but so it is. The jurists, of course, some of you may recall the names of the Americans at least. Melville Weston Fuller, who was Chief Justice of the United States, and David Josiah Brewer, who was also at the time a judge of the Supreme Court of the United States. Very distinguished jurists, men of, I presume, great integrity. The Russian jurist, von Martins, was the foremost international scholar of international law at his time. The British were no less eminent, Charles Russell and Sir Richard Hen Collins, judges of the United Kingdom's highest court as well. So they weren't terribly interested. Everyone dismissed it. Nothing much was happening. But as the colonial project of Great Britain was winding down across the world in the days after the Second World War, there was great concern about some misbehavior that was taking place in Guyana. In the 50s, there were riots and protests. The British sent in their army to quell them. In the early 60s, there were riots again that were unfortunately based on race clashes between the descendants of Africans and the descendants of Indian indentured workers. Lots of political agitation. The CIA is involved in funding some of the agitation and fomenting some of the discord. While we're still a British colony, all of this was being done by the American government. Now, depending on who you ask, it's painted as an enormous evil by the United States. But there's some very simple explanations for this. You'll recall that following the Second World War, Germany ended up being divided East and West Germany, Russian control, Western control. Unfortunately, after the fall of Japan, following the atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Korea at the time was a Japanese colony. With the collapse of Japan's control of Korea, Korea fell into control, unfortunately, along similar lines of a battle between Americans and, well, let's say Western forces and forces controlled by Russia, Chinese and domestic Korean forces. And these hard lines of a conflict in the world were emerging, the Cold War, this division between West and East, between democracy or capitalism, and the forces of communism. Now, having gone through such horrible wars, the Second World War, the Korean War, there's obviously a buildup in Vietnam. You recall the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of these are contemporary events. Now, seen from the perspective of the Americans, the idea of allowing someone with communist sympathies taking control of a new country on the coast of South America is something the Americans would not allow under any circumstances. The most popular politician in Guyana at the time, Dr. Cheddi Jagon, descendant of East Indian immigrants. He was a dentist, studied at Howard University in the early 1950s, in the 40s, just after the Second World War. His wife, Janet Rosenberg, was a descendant of Russian emigres to the United States, and they were avowedly communist. Dr. Jagon, of blessed memory, would go on United States television and radio and speak of the virtues of communism. In retrospect, I mean, unfortunately for Dr. Jagon, this could only be seen as political suicide. His great rival, Linder Forbes Sampson Burnham, was a British trained lawyer, descendant of African slaves. Great socialist sympathies, but far more careful in what he would say. And so he was clearly favored by both the British and the Americans, and the after the racial conflict had descended, they changed the political or the voting system, and Forbes Burnham's new party won elections. But in this lead up to independence, the Venezuelans are there complaining about this boundary. The British are broke, desperate to leave. The Americans are terrified of communism. As part of the independence arrangements, they caused an agreement to be signed on the cusp of independence, which provided, among other things, that the parties would work on their negotiations to resolve the conflict. And ultimately, if they couldn't agree, the Secretary General of the United Nations was authorized to pick the means of resolving the dispute. And so discussions under the leadership of the Secretary General starting in 1966 continued all the way through 2018. A very long time to talk about fixing your quarrel, 49 years, 52 years. And if you can't fix it in 52 years by conversation, something else has to happen. And so the government of Ghana told the Secretary General that it wasn't going anywhere. They wanted the issue to be referred to the International Court of Justice. The Secretary General agreed, and there we are. The International Court of Justice, as you know, is one of the agencies that came out of the Second World War, along with some less complimentary ones, the IMF, the World Bank, depending on where you sit. And for all its flaws, the United Nations has done a great job over the years. The International Court of Justice has the power to make binding decisions. Where they're not complied with, the International Court of Justice can refer the matter to a related United Nations body, which is the Security Council. The Security Council can take measures as it sees fit. So there is the possibility, if there's a ruling in Ghana's favor, that the Security Council may be persuaded to consider the matter. Given the current setup of the Security Council, though, with Russia having a veto power and Russia currently being a great ally of Venezuela, the likelihood of the Security Council doing anything is slim to none. The likelihood of military conflict is fairly low grade. The United States, of course, has a great interest in Ghana because of Exxon and the tremendous discoveries of oil offshore about 10 years ago. They do maintain a modest military presence offshore. A few months ago, there were some fighter jets doing flyovers, US fighter jets doing flyovers in Georgetown. Venezuela is not keen for military conflict, but there's a lot that they can do short of military conflict. Because of the size of their population and poverty in Venezuela, there have been significant migration to neighboring countries, Colombia, way down all across South America, countries that are not even neighboring, and of course, Guyana. The city is filled with Venezuelan migrants. Maybe not quite as bad as in some US border cities, but it's a huge change for us. And of course, mixed in with these populations, there are all sorts of criminal gangs and perhaps some military elements in between. Venezuela has the population that they can settle border towns, and getting people to leave once they're settled is going to be difficult. So they're short of military conflict, there's demographic problems, there's migration problems, there's occupation by civilian populations, and it is potentially destabilizing. But who knows where it will go. For the time being, the United States is a great friend of Guyana, but these things are never static. It's always shifting. But we live in hope, and by God's grace, it doesn't do too much harm to us in the end. Thank you all for listening patiently. It's a subject I could drone on for hours. I'd be happy to answer any questions in the few minutes that we have left.